In this video, I'm going to share some fascinating facts about the elves of the Lord of the Rings that might sound obvious to readers of the books, but surprising to those who only watch the movies. I hope at least one of these facts is new or insightful to you. Let's dive in. 1. Almost all elves who die in battle come back to life. Like most fans, I first discovered Tolkien's world through the movies. And captivated by the story, I later turned to the books to understand everything more deeply. Before reading them, one of the things I found most tragic was the death of an elf in battle. I used to think, imagine being able to live forever, never aging, but dying because you went to war. What a waste. Haldir's death at Helm's Deep, for instance, felt like the peak of that tragedy. Today, I know that in the books, Haldir doesn't actually die at Helm's Deep. But still, the logic seemed the same for any elf, right? Any elf killed in battle was losing the chance to live eternally. How surprised I was when I read the following passage from Tolkien's letter 212. The elves were not subject to disease, but they could be slain. That is, their bodies could be destroyed or mutilated so as to be unfit to sustain life. But this did not lead naturally to death. They were rehabilitated and reborn and eventually recovered memory of all their past. They remained identical. So it's not as tragic as it seems. I mean, it's still tragic. Dying in combat must be painful, being separated from loved ones for an uncertain time. But they eventually return to life and even retain the memories of their past. In short, the process worked like this. If an elf's body was destroyed, their spirit would travel to the halls of Mandos in Aman. After a certain period, they would be brought back to life, reborn. Tolkien didn't like the word reincarnate, so he used reborn instead. I'm not entirely sure why, but out of respect for his choice, I'll use his term. He also explained that the Valar prepared new bodies for the elves when they returned. But of course, there were exceptions. Not every elf was allowed to return. There were two situations in which they wouldn't come back. First, if the elf didn't want to, they were not forced to return. It sounds unlikely, but there are examples. Feanor's mother, Miriel, felt so exhausted after giving birth that she willingly lay down and her spirit went to the halls of Mandos. She refused rebirth. Quote again from letter 212. Miriel wished to abandon being and refused rebirth. Secondly, if an elf had committed great evil or cruelty in life, Mandos could leave them sleeping indefinitely. 2. Why were elves called Eldar? We often hear the elves referred to as the Eldar, but what does that actually mean? And why were they called that? Eldar means people of the stars, and it was the Vala Orome who first gave them that name. That's because the elves awoke before the creation of the sun and moon. The very first light they ever saw came from the stars. From that moment, they felt a deep connection to starlight, which is why the stars became sacred to them. Beyond the emotional symbolism, there's also a practical side. In the books, elves need far less sleep than men. They can go long stretches without rest when necessary, and the light that guides them through the darkness of night is, of course, the stars. 3. The difference between elves and high elves. For those who only watch the movies, it's easy to get the wrong impression, as if Middle-earth were the name of the entire planet. But that's not true. Middle-earth is just one of the continents. Here's a simple breakdown. The planet itself is called Arda. Middle-earth is one continent, and across the Great Sea lies Aman, also known as the Undying Lands, home of the Valar. I know many people hate the map you're seeing on screen, because it's not accurate since it tries to merge different ages into one image. But, in my opinion, it's the most visually intuitive way to represent it, especially for viewers who've only seen the movies. But the point is, over the ages, the world's geography changed dramatically. During the Second Age, for example, the island in the center, Númenor, sank beneath the waves. The continent of Aman was removed from the physical world, and much of the western part of Middle-earth, known as Beleriand, was flooded. Now, back to the point. High Elves refers to those who once lived in Aman and witnessed the divine light of the two sacred trees, Laurelin and Telperion. High Elves are also called Calaquendi, or Elves of the Light. Galadriel is one of them. She didn't just see the trees, she was born and raised beneath their light. Tolkien even wrote that her hair reflected a small portion of that divine radiance. That's why in the movies, Galadriel literally glows. It's Peter Jackson's way of showing visually that she's a high elf. Those sacred trees were destroyed by Morgoth, Sauron's master, which means that the number of high elves is extremely limited. And if the overall number of high elves was already small, it was even smaller during the events of The Lord of the Rings. There's some debate among fans about how many still remained in Middle-earth at that time. Of those named, we know for sure only 3: Galadriel, Glorfindel, and Gildor Inglorian. Galadriel needs no introduction. Glorfindel and Gildor, however, don't appear clearly in the movies, at least not in any recognizable way. A possible 4th high elf was Maglor, one of Feanor's sons, who lost his sanity and is said to have wandered the shores of Middle-earth until the end of days. We don't know if he truly survived, or if that was meant as a metaphor, since he was never seen or mentioned again. Aside from those 4, there's also a small group of high elves, relatives of Galadriel, who make a brief appearance in the first film. Frodo and Sam see them departing in that serene, moonlit scene. Unlike in the movie, though, the books show that the hobbits actually spoke to these elves. They even saved Frodo and his friends from a Nazgul and let them spend the night in their camp. As Tolkien writes in The Fellowship of the Ring, "These are high elves. They spoke the name of Elbereth," said Frodo in amazement. "Not many now remain in Middle-earth, east of the Great Sea. This is indeed a strange chance." Now, the main question is, okay, we know that high elves shine, but what else sets them apart? Being bathed in the sacred light of the trees granted them a kind of physical, mental, and spiritual boost. That's why the elves of the First Age were so far above the rest. The passage that best describes this, in my opinion, is from the Silmarillion. The Noldor, outnumbered and taken at unawares, were yet swiftly victorious. For the light of Aman was not yet dimmed in their eyes, and they were strong and swift and deadly in anger, and their swords were long and terrible. The orcs fled before them. 4. The Elves and the Undying Lands. Elvish immortality has nothing to do with the Undying Lands. At first glance, the name might sound as if anyone who went there would become immortal, but that's not the case. The Undying Lands are called that because immortal beings live there. Frodo, Bilbo, Sam, and Gimli are living proof that mortals don't become immortal simply by traveling there. Sauron, however, exploited this misconception to deceive the men of Númenor. He told them that those who lived in Aman would gain eternal life, and that lie led directly to Númenor's downfall and its submersion beneath the sea. In truth, the Undying Lands are more like a paradise for the elves, a place of rest and healing, not a source of immortality. Their eternal life comes from their own nature, not the land they dwell in. 5. The 3 kindreds of elves, Vanyar, Noldor, and Teleri. Tolkien's world is so rich in detail that even within a single race there are distinctions among different peoples. For example, among men we have ordinary men, Dunedain, those with Númenorian blood, and hobbits, the so-called little folk. All of them are human in essence, just with different traits. Tolkien himself wrote in The Peoples of Middle-earth, hobbits, on the other hand, were in nearly all respects normal men, but of very short stature. The same applies to the elves. They too are divided into 3 main kindreds, the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri, each with its own characteristics and strengths. Belonging to one kindred doesn't affect whether an elf is a high elf or not. If a Vanya once lived in the presence of the 2 trees, they'd be a high elf just like a Noldo who did the same. Though distinct, these groups were closely connected and often intermarried. Galadriel herself had the blood of all 3. Her paternal grandmother was Vanyar, her grandfather was Noldor, and her mother was Teleri. Let's start with the Vanyar. They were mostly golden-haired and deeply devoted to the Valar. They excelled in poetry and song, and Tolkien described them as the fairest of all the Eldar. The Teleri, meanwhile, typically had dark or silver hair. They were lovers of the sea and master shipbuilders. This is the most diverse kindred, as many subgroups descended from them. The Sindar, the Nondor, and the Sylvan Elves, to name a few. And finally, the Noldor. They tended to have slightly darker skin and were the most skilled in both warfare and craftsmanship. Many of the greatest elves in Tolkien's legendarium came from this kindred. those most deeply involved in the great conflicts of the First Age. So, in summary, the Vanyar were the poets, the Teleri were the builders, and the Noldor were the warriors. Of course, any of them could fight if needed, but those were their main skills. If you like this kind of video, consider subscribing and leaving a like for more. It really helps small channels like this. Take care and see you in the next one.